Welcome to the first session of COFEM's Knowledge Summit. This is the session where we talk about why does a feminist perspective matter in work to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls. We're delighted to have you join us on this day, which is also the International Day of No Violence Against Women, which starts the 16 days of activism for the elimination of violence against women and girls. Next slide. So my name is Anu, and I'm going to be one of the presenters today. I'm here really excited to be here today to share my experiences and thoughts on this topic and to hear from all of you who have joined the call. I'm co-presenting the session with my friend and COFEM member, Heather. Hi, Heather.
Hi, Anu. It's good to be here.
So if you want to know more about Anu and Heather, our profiles are on the COFEM link that we sent to you, so please look up more information about us. We would also have loved to have had the time to hear from each of you and have you introduce yourselves, but this is not possible with respect to time. So we would like you all to take a moment now to write your name and say why you are here. Do this in the chat box so that we have a sense of who is here. We will also have a Q&A session halfway through where you'll all have a chance to speak and ask questions. If you've used Zoom before, please use the raise your hand function and we'll unmute you so that you can speak, or write in the chat that you want to speak and we'll unmute you if you don't know how to use the raise your hand function. Also, in case you have questions or comments during the presentation, please write them immediately into the chat box, and Lauren, who's also on the call, will pick them up. These questions will be answered first in the Q&A session, and we will also read out your comments. Next slide. So we're going to start by answering the question, who is COFEM? For those of you who may be joining for the first time or not have a lot of background about who we are. So over a period of time, and certainly since I joined the international humanitarian sector about 10 years ago, feminist academics, activists, and practitioners experienced the way that the feminist perspective was actively declining in both humanitarian and development spaces. We individually felt threatened and isolated, unable to speak out for fear of losing our jobs and being sidelined. Many feminists at this time chose to leave these spaces and looked for more nurturing places within which to work. But many of us chose to stay and see if we could find a way through it. In 2016, through conversations with different people and incidents that happened over time, we started talking to each other. And thanks to Raising Voices and the Novo Foundation, a small group were able to meet in New York in 2016 to discuss and analyze this phenomenon, and mainly to support each other. We found that it was so widespread and growing, this declining of the feminist perspective, that we decided to formalize a network in order to begin to address this issue. And this is how COFEM came about. It was formally created in 2017 as a membership network. Next slide. So we are here where we are with violence against women and girls because of the critical work that was done by women's movements and brave individuals over the last 3 decades. So COFEM's key strength lies in the collective expertise and experience of our members, who have made significant contributions to advancing women's rights and ending violence against women and girls in humanitarian and development settings across the world. Next slide. Together, we have developed a few ideas for how we can infuse a feminist perspective into our work. We've written papers that we presented at the Sexual Violence Research Institute conference, and the Feminist Pocketbook, which is tip sheets on how better to deal with the issue of the declining feminist perspective. We've also, we'll talk more about these in the sessions that follow. So all these topics and resources will be fully explored, and we will talk more about these issues that we have on the slide. Sorry, I just lost something. In brief, what we are advocating for is that we reclaim space, so we do not apologize for working only with women or keeping women in the center of our work. It's about not getting trapped into the argument that gender is about men and women and that men are being discriminated against. We need to be clear that gender inequality is a product of oppressive patriarchal thinking and practice that is aimed at women and girls, however they identify. So these are one of the topics that will be discussed over this next few sessions, the next sessions on the Knowledge Summit. We also think it's essential to link violence against women and girls and GBV to the theory of gender inequality. So promoting theory and programming and linking it to gender inequality. In other words, the politics of why there is gender inequality in the first place, that it's not an accident of distribution, it's the result of systemic discrimination against women and girls. And of course, men and boys are critical allies, but must be accountable to women and girls. Otherwise, it becomes a case of all lives matter when we're trying to highlight a system of discrimination that is killing women and girls. However, we do not want to compete with others about who is the victim. So we need to work with other specialists and as allies to refer different forms of violence to the appropriate channels. Next slide. So these are the tools that we have created since we began in 2017 as a network. We have got the Feminist Pocketbook, and there's a link that you can click on to go to the Feminist Pocketbook. And we have the series of papers and videos for which there is a link on the slide. And now we come to the Knowledge Summit, which is also one of the products of the work that we've been doing. And here on this slide, you can see that we have 6 sessions, and the first topic is this one that we're talking about today. Why does a feminist perspective matter in work to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls? It features 6 sessions led by COFEM members on topics covered in COFEM's latest learning and advocacy tool, the Feminist Pocketbook. And as you can see, the dates and the topics are on the slide. And we hope that you will all be able to join us for these sessions over the coming days till December the 10th. And here are the links to register for the other sessions and the Zoom dial-in details for all sessions. So over to you, Heather. Why does a feminist perspective matter in work to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls? I invite you to speak about the next session, the next part of this session.
Thank you, Anu, and thank you also for participating, everyone who's on the call. I think it's really important, and I think we really appreciate people giving up their Sunday to talk about this. And as Anu said, it is the beginning of the 16 Days of Activism against violence against women and girls, so it feels really important, and I feel very honoured actually to be presenting on this session. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. So when we talk about a feminist perspective, we mean something really specific by it and really concrete about it. And one of the things that we mean when we talk about a feminist perspective is having a really clear theory of violence to help us understand what violence means, what it represents, and the purpose that it serves. Because violence against women and girls is purposeful. It's not random, it's not individual, that it is serving a purpose in a wider gender hierarchy. And so what having that theory of violence enables us to do is join the dots between different kinds of violence and build a bigger picture of the context within which it's happening. What I mean by that is that if we think about, for example, domestic violence, and we think about a husband beating a wife, some theories of violence would suggest that it's because he's frustrated, or he's stressed, or he's been drinking, or he's under pressure, or he's poor. And that's one theory of violence. That's one explanation for why he's doing what he's doing. A feminist perspective would say that, well, but women are poor and women are stressed, women sometimes drink, women are frustrated, and it's not women who are doing this. So what is it that's underneath this? What purpose is it serving, and where's it coming from? And when we have a feminist theory of violence, what we're saying is that that power relationship and the power inequality that is about gender roles and gender hierarchies is sustained through the use of violence. It's also, so that individual violence is serving a purpose. It is serving to subordinate that woman in her marriage. And a feminist theory of violence will also say that this is enabled, explained, justified, and rationalized by social norms, which will say that men are the head of the household, that men should be decision makers, that it's men's responsibility to discipline their wives, and that they can claim the power to do that. And then outside that, there are systems and structures of gender oppression that reinforce and code those norms into practice. So if, for example, a woman is handed to her husband's family on her marriage, that reinforces the idea that she belongs to him and he has a right to discipline her. And so a feminist perspective enables us to draw all of those lines and make sense and meaning out of that violence in a wider way than the individual. And that's really important, because what it allows us to do is see the ways in which gender inequality and gender hierarchies are structured, coded, and explained. And what that allows us to do is to see how different kinds of violence against women and girls are connected between each other and with each other. So sexual violence, then, we can understand it in the context of men's ownership of women's bodies. We can understand early marriage as part of the systems where women are transferred between men. And so that kind of feminist perspective allows us to see that this kind of violence is about power, it's about resources, it's about opportunity, and it's systemic. And that changes how we start intervening and thinking about intervening. Because one of the reasons why theory of violence is so important is that all our practice is theory and action, whether we know what that theory is or not. And so one of the biggest things for us is understanding the theory of violence, because it allows us to practice well and to have an impact. The other thing that's really important is when we have an understanding of violence as a face of oppression and as a critical mechanism of sustaining oppression, it helps us to think about intersecting violences and intersecting oppressions. So, for example, if we're talking about violence against children, the kind of violence that boys experience as boys is not the same as the violence that girls experience in quantity, quality, or meaning. And so that helps us think about what we need to do to bring about change. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. So a feminist perspective matters then because, and it's the foundation of what we're going to be talking about over this Knowledge Summit, because it takes us beyond interpersonal dynamics, and it helps us to situate this violence in a much more clear and systemic way. It also enables us to predict and anticipate where we're going to see violence against women and girls, and in humanitarian context particularly, this is really, really important. If we know that there is a patriarchal hierarchy, we can predict that there will be violence against women and girls that will happen in very specific ways. And that helps us to plan, it helps us with preparedness, and it helps us to respond quicker and more effectively. We need to keep focus on power. We need to think about power and resources particularly. Who makes decisions, who allocates resources, who controls resources, and who defines what's happening. And that is incredibly important within a feminist theory of violence and a feminist perspective. Who gets to say what this experience is, and who gets to say who gets to say what resources will be allocated. And it helps us to come back to the intersecting inequalities and to not lose sight of how present and how pervasive gender inequality is. If we're talking about disabilities, for example, we really need to bring a gendered and a feminist perspective to that, because the context for women with disabilities is very different from the context for men with disabilities. So that's been very fast because I'm very mindful of time. Can I have the next slide? There we are. So I'm going to ask Anu some questions now about what this kind of feminist perspective means in action. And we're going to talk about different dimensions of this. All of the topics that we're talking about in this section will be covered in later sessions in this series. So this is really intended as an introduction and as a starting point, and as the foundation really of what else is going to be discussed later on. So Anu, my question for you is, how do you see the limitations of a human rights perspective when we're talking about women and girls? And what do you think is the importance of bringing a feminist analysis to a human rights approach?
Thanks, Heather, for that question. There's a lot that I can say about the feminist perspective of human rights. And but I think it's enough to say that we really need to scrutinize this perspective and understand that human rights, in the way that it was formulated, is androcentric, meaning that it's male-centered, male-based, and based on the false dichotomy of the public and private spheres of life. So many human rights indicators, though not all, use male experience as the norm, and the achievement of human rights, women's human rights, is seen as relative to the achievement of men's rights. So the typical human rights data show that women are discriminated against insofar as they have not achieved the same rights as men, despite the efforts put forth by many feminists to expand and reframe notions of rights that take into account the difference of women and men's lived reality. So all too often, too much emphasis is placed on the material relations of power and empowerment, and it often excludes the social and ideological relations of power. Because of this, it can look as if women's human rights have been achieved, and many mistakes have been made with programming because of this notion. It can mask the daily realities of gender-based oppression in many women's lives. So as feminists, we're concerned that this type of outcome creates an impression that women no longer require assistance and that men are much more needy beneficiaries. And as a result, as we know and what we're experiencing, that there's a masculinization of both the development and human rights discourses. We need to remember that gender inequality is not separate from class, race, ethnicity, age, and sexual inequalities. But given the current construction of human rights, we are forced to construct and evaluate gender equality and the achievement of human rights in very narrow and rigid ways. So we need to advocate much more for human rights data that captures gender inequality in multi-dimensional and intersectional ways. For example, in the United States right now, we are seeing a massive unraveling of women's sexual and reproductive health rights. If women do not have the right to bodily autonomy, that is a fundamental breach of their rights. And these decisions are made by men and can be taken away at any moment. And I think this is, for me, the most important message about having a feminist perspective to human rights, is that we have a very precarious hold on the gains we have made, and resistance is everywhere. Our rights as women are not guaranteed, not assured. It's not certain that it's a given. We still have to defend them all the time. And this is why a feminist perspective is essential when we're talking about human rights.
Thank you, Anu. And I agree with you. In my experience, what I see is an awful lot of words on paper and that are under attack, actually. And also, we are so busy defending our rights that we don't always have the time to exercise them fully in our lives. So just to take that a step further, what's your thoughts on the argument around culture as part of the resistance to women's rights? How can we and how should we engage with the argument that talking about this, or advocating for women, or being aligned with women's rights movements is an external intervention and a challenge to culture?
Yes, this is a challenge for all of us, because we are often told that this is in our culture and that culture overrides rights. And I think that that's a deeply racist thing to say. And this is why a feminist perspective on culture is critical. A feminist perspective identifies culture as a dynamic political practice and moves it away from cultural essentialism, or the idea that culture is somehow homogeneous, static, internally consistent, natural, and equally owned by everybody. We should be asking the question, whose culture is it? Who defined that culture? And what purpose does it serve? I think you said that earlier, that from a feminist perspective, we always need to ask that question. What purpose is it serving? Cultural essentialism as such is a form of cultural relativism, in that it often positions itself as traditional and authentic, and therefore not subject to critical examination. As feminists, we define culture as an ongoing process, and this reveals the gendered power dynamics embedded in the way that culture is constructed. Culture and religious practices are constructed and perpetuated. So if we understand culture in this way, we can ask to what degree are members of this culture group able to participate in defining the culture, as well as who benefits from this particular version of culture. A good way to look at it is that, from my experience, and in every country that I've worked in, there is a vibrant women's movement, and that's part of the culture. And those women are trying to change the culture. So that needs to be understood as part of the process of negotiating culture. There are women trying very hard to change certain things, and programming again makes this big mistake when it overrides human rights with culture. An example that comes to mind is that, working in Nepal with after the earthquake, is how the humanitarians reconstructed a cultural practice of isolating women who are menstruating by rebuilding the isolation room. When the women's movement had been advocating for years, and they were really angry because they said it has taken us 25 years to try to reverse that cultural practice and to get it to be stopped. So I think this tells you why a feminist perspective is absolutely essential when talking about culture.
Thanks, Anu. And yes, I think that this question of where we align ourselves and who we align ourselves with in our responses and in our programming is really critical. difficult, because the example you just gave about Nepal, that, intentionally or not, became part of contributing to women's oppression, actually, that response, and really actively contributed to that and went against what women's rights movements were trying to do. I think that it behoves all of us to really pay attention and critically examine who we are aligned with and who we are standing in solidarity with. So my last question for you for the moment is about language, and I'm really interested to hear what you think and how you think about the kind of language that we see when we hear about gender difference, for instance, and we hear the kind of men, women, equal, different, and we hear gender neutrality, and we hear gender sensitivity, and we hear gender balance. These are phrases that we hear a lot, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts on those.
Well, Heather, what I can say first of all is this is one of my pet peeves. I really don't believe in the term gender neutral. I mean, is it really neutral? We don't live in a neutral world. It's hierarchical. Neutrality is a myth. I know that it's a masculine norm that is being adhered to and is being termed as neutral. So when you say something's neutral, it's not. It's being measured against a masculine norm. So it's not neutral at all, is it? I think we need to critically examine all these terms. And from a feminist perspective, you will see that when you really unpack them, they lead us down the wrong path. Gender sensitivity is also very problematic. For example, gender sensitive indicators just means that there's a recognition of a gender dimension without needing to do anything about it. So then in the context of oppression, these terms can be dangerous because they can reduce a very big socio-political issue to technical wordsmithing. It's, in my view, it's rearranging the same furniture in the room and calling it a major renovation.
I suspect that that's a very, very familiar feeling to a lot of people who are listening to this, the endless rearranging of furniture without examining the room that the furniture is in. Thank you, Anu. Can we have the next slide? Okay, Anu, this is over to you now.
And the way the slide people have gone.
It's there. We have it.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So this is, sorry, I had the wrong slide up. This is me now talking to you, Heather, about feminist perspectives in action. And what can you say about, there's this term that's often spoken about in feminist literature about about the private is public. So what can you say about that? Can we predict violence against women and girls in crisis situations? And when we say evidence, does it mean that we have to collect data every time we want to work on violence against women and girls?
I think this is a really important question. And I think that in a wider world, the way that gender hierarchies work, there is a very clear distinction between the public and the private. And we are very concerned socially with public violence. We can be quite exercised about stranger danger. We can be quite exercised about rape by fighting forces, for instance. And we indeed have the whole PSVI initiative, which is about exactly that. We talk a lot about external agents, and we're fine and quite comfortable to talk about that. At the same time, when we have this feminist theory of violence, and we're talking about the ways in which women's subordination is manifest in everyday ways, what we're less willing to talk about is the private violence. So by that I mean violence in the private sphere. So I mean husbands beating wives, husbands keeping money away from women, limiting their movement, rape within marriage, all of those kinds of everyday things that are much less comfortable to talk about because they raise very difficult questions about our idealized social selves. We want to maintain an idea of the family, for example, that's very positive and very happy and very healthy and very normal. And what we are very much less concerned about and quite resistant to very often is thinking about the family and family dynamics and close communities as sites of oppression for women and violence for women, and of sites where inequality is manifest in very, very everyday and unexceptional ways. What's really important when we think about responding in emergencies, and I suspect that a lot of people on this call will have had this experience, is there is an emergency in a conflict, something happens, women start moving, and there is surprise that there is violence against women. And if you have a feminist perspective, it's not a surprise at all, because within that social structure prior to the conflict, there was a fantastic amount of violence against women and girls, but it was private violence, and so not considered and not understood and not recognised and made to go away or explained away by culture. And so when it erupts into the public sphere in conflicts, there is quite often that idea of, oh my God, there's all this violence against women. And with a feminist perspective, we knew that was going to happen. We absolutely knew it was going to happen. And then what we also see quite often is an extension of that violence, which tries to protect in a slightly sideways way. So we see, for example, adolescent girls being married off as an attempt to protect them from other unknown men. But what we don't recognise in that necessarily is that that in itself is a form of violence, that that adolescent girl is being married to a man who is very much older than she is and who will be expecting to have sex with her. So it becomes then a trade between the private violence of that marriage and the public violence of fighting forces. But they're coming from the same root. And so if we understand that patriarchal systems are built on and built around violence against women and girls, we can predict that in a crisis, it's going to become public. And I think that this brings me into the sexual exploitation and abuse piece, and there's been a lot of conversation about this year, and I hope that it doesn't stop soon. I am sincerely hoping that this isn't another moment where it subsides and then we have the same conversation again in 10 years from now. But I think one of the things that we see with this is not only humanitarian staff and peacekeepers and whoever else, but also within displaced populations, we see a massive increase in sexual exploitation of women and girls. And if we have that feminist perspective, we keep asking why. And the questions that I come back to is, why don't women and girls have resources? Why don't they? Why are they so desperate and so impoverished that they are really exposed to this kind of exploitation? And why is it that men evidently do have resources that women and girls are trying to get hold of? And then there's another why. Why aren't those men sharing those resources without sexually exploiting women and girls? And so that kind of keeping, with a feminist perspective, to keep digging into this instead of assuming that that's just what happens or that's normal. And I think when we were talking earlier, Anu, one of the things that I said to you was, it's extraordinary to me that we take for granted that when men have resources, they will demand sexual services from women and girls in order to share those resources. I have been giving money and other support to women and girls for over 30 years, and not once have I ever demanded any kind of sexual exchange. It's entirely possible to share resources without doing that. But we take it for granted that sexual exploitation is a given. But with a feminist perspective, we dig into, well, why is that? Why do men do that? Why do men have that entitlement to the bodies of women and girls? And why do men have the resources? And why don't women and girls have those resources? So for me, those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking really loudly and really publicly. And in terms of generating the data and the research, I think this goes back to what I said at the beginning, this idea that in every emergency or every context, there is a sudden surprise that there is violence. And quite often a request and a demand that we will generate evidence to demonstrate that. And I think that that is a conversation that we have had far too many times. When we can predict it, we can get the data. If we start with services, the data will come. We will get data because women and girls will use the services and we will generate the data from practice. And I think one of the things that will be in a later session is about practice-based evidence and how we collect and document what we're hearing without having to prove its existence first.
Thanks, Heather. I think you've raised some really important points there, and particularly, around the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse and why women get so desperate, and to counter those claims that the women want it and therefore it's okay. So we need to be always asking why they're in that situation. Mm-hmm. We've passed our halfway mark, so I think we want to just quickly go through the next slide, and so that we can allow our participants to ask some questions. And I'm hoping that they are recording their questions or their comments. So let's do this so that we can get there and get with enough time for some feedback. So over to you.
No, this one, I was going to ask you questions about this. So this is really about what you see as the issues between the language of protection and the language of oppression, and then how that intersects with child protection and other oppressive dynamics.
Yeah, so I'm just going to very quickly give you my thoughts on that, and because I think it's pretty much in the same line of what we've been saying all along. But just to highlight the issue of the term protection. When I first heard that they were using this term protection, I thought right from the beginning that it was problematic, because immediately my thought was that it will lead to protectionist thinking, and I wasn't wrong. And what I mean by that is that protection gets translated into women need protection. They're weak and vulnerable, and therefore we have to protect them. And my experience in countries where women are very subordinate to men, this is exactly how it got translated. That, we are protecting the women. We lock them up and keep them at home and protect them. And this is what we're supposed to do as men. And so we're doing really well. It also can get translated into, and what it does get translated into, is you have to protect yourself from being harmed. So we limit your freedoms, we limit your behavior, we tell you how to dress. And if anything bad happens to you, then it's your fault for not protecting yourself. So I think, again, we need to ask the questions: who needs protecting from what and from whom? We are clear, I think, as feminists, that women and girls need to be protected from men's violence, and that their rights to live their lives is protected. Again, with child protection, the gender dimension is that violence against children is different for girls and boys. It's not this; it wouldn't be the same. And I think you mentioned that earlier when you spoke. And mothers are expected to protect their children without recognizing that they too are being subjected to abuse and often cannot stop the violence. So these are, important points to think about when you think about the term protection and the issue of protection. And again, it's important and absolutely critical that we're always thinking about the intersections with age, disability, ethnicity, so that the specific and particular oppressions that women and girls face don't get lost. What we don't want is to be replicating and reinforcing a gender hierarchy.
Thanks, Anu. I think when you were talking just as well about the protection piece, one of the things that came to my mind was how, if we're not careful, that whole protectionist agenda really makes any kind of accountability for perpetrators disappear. Because you're right, the whole focus becomes about protect yourself from this external threat, which takes for granted that that threat exists and takes for granted that that threat is continuing, doesn't question why that violence is there, why those men are choosing to do that violence to women and children, and girls in particular. And it also doesn't hold, because it frames it as inevitable, it doesn't then allow for any kind of accountability. And you're right, what we see in practice is the spaces to act of women and girls being shrunk in that kind of, well, don't go there because you know it's dangerous, and don't do that because you know it's dangerous, and don't do this because you know it's dangerous, which really shrinks a space to act and really counteracts actually any rights agenda. And what it doesn't do is turn the focus and the spotlight towards perpetrators and say, how are we going to make you stop doing this? You have to stop doing it. And what it also does, I think, is fail to recognise that the protection risks, to use that language, very often come from men who are well known and very close to women and girls. It comes from men in their families, men in their communities, men in places where they have no choice but to be. So yeah, I think that it's a really slippery conceptual framing, and I think it's a really unhelpful one.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just thinking, Heather, that we're at we've run over our time that we wanted to speak and want to hear from others. So should we just go straight into the Q&A?
If we can have the next slide. This really, this is just to point it up that these are things that we have touched on today and that will be covered in later sessions in this series in more detail. So things like where the money goes in emergencies, how we advocate, how we can be prepared, better prepared, and how we can respond better. And then also on staying woman-centred. So we don't need to discuss that in depth now, but it's really to say that all of these things are central topics in later sessions that others will be picking up on. So we don't need to go into detail right now because it will be part of later conversations. And then, yes, we can go to the Q&A.
Good. So the floor's open now for questions and comments from the participants.
Hi, Anu and Heather. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And to start off this Q&A session, I'd like to remind all participants that you can feel free to raise your hand in Zoom to be unmuted to ask questions during this Q&A session, or you can send along any additional questions in the chat box. Thank you.
No questions? Have we been talking to ourselves, Heather?
It would not be the first time. I think somebody has a hand up. Lauren, Alina has her hand up. Can you unmute her so that she can?
Yes, just a moment, figuring out how to do that.
I think it's on now. Alina, are you there? No, not.
Alina, do you want to type it and then we can answer you? If you put it in the chat box, we can answer you.
Hi, can you all hear me?
I can hear you now.
Oh, you can hear me now?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay,
No,
great.
what not to be about? Yeah, I can.
There may be
I
some
can-
background noise. I'm not sure where that's coming from. But
That means.
can you hear me, Anu and Heather?
Yes.
But it seems like everybody else is unmuted now.
Ah, okay. I'll ask quickly and then you can mute everybody again. You gave a great example of programming in Nepal that did not support women and girls and didn't take a feminist perspective and so did not support women and girls. I'm wondering if you can give any examples from your experience where a feminist perspective was taken and it really did support women and girls, either in an emergency context or development context.
Anu, do you want to answer that?
I'm not sure what's happening now.
There you are. We can hear you. Alina's
Okay.
question was about examples of interventions where a feminist perspective has led to interventions that have supported women and girls. Do you have an example that you want to share?
In the humanitarian sector?
Either, I think.
I think perhaps the example of a feminist perspective in, putting up, recognizing, for example, in the Liberian post-conflict, that, bringing a feminist perspective into why women and girls were not participating in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was one way that it really brought in a methodology and an understanding that women and girls would not be able to participate if actions weren't taken to bring their voices into the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the commissioners actually went to the women. So this was really very different. Usually they sit in the capital and they hold these meetings, and majority of the women can't actually participate because they can't get there, and they don't know how to participate. So this was a really quite a revolutionary thing that they did, was to going out into the most remote rural areas and talking to the women and inviting their participation. So I think that is an example that just comes to mind of how bringing a feminist perspective into a situation, in a crisis situation, actually can be very beneficial.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat box. It says, I wonder if you can share your wisdom about how we should be moving forward to ensure a feminist perspective is more regularly employed in work on VAWG in humanitarian and development settings. Speaking for myself, I'm not sure I have any wisdom about this. I think that partly COFEM came about as a response to that question, because, as Anu said at the beginning, for a lot of feminist women doing this work, we have been having to have our elbows out to hold the space for a really long time. And I think that it can be incredibly isolating, it can be incredibly difficult, it's not a popular and welcome perspective or opinion in many organisations. And so part of this process really about COFEM was being able to speak with a more collective voice and to generate the resources that we can cite, that we can quote, that we can use to really support what we're saying. And I think it's a long plod. I think it's a really, really long plod. Many of the organisations and institutions that we work in are also patriarchal and are reproducing those kinds of dynamics and structures. And I think one of the things that I've seen this year, particularly in the kind of aid to crisis, first is that it's very rare for feminist women in organisations to be promoted above middle management. We're allowed to go so far and no further. Second, that when all of this exploded, there was an awful lot of, oh my God, this is awful. We had no idea, apart from all the feminists who were saying, well, we've been telling you this for 10 years and you're not listening. And so I think there is something really important about working together in this and collaborating and citing the resources and using each other, because the standards that we're held to have any credibility are very much higher. And I think that there are, in the tip sheets, there is a document about backlash, which I think is part of this conversation too. And I think that when we're talking about backlash, really, we're talking about power doing what power does, which is resisting women's assertion and expectation around our own space, our own interests, and our own political and social advancement. So I'm not sure that really helps in answering the question, but I do think that it's important to recognise that there is a parallel process going on, that we are engaged in the same kind of resistance to patriarchal power as we are advocating for women in the circumstances where we work.
And I think, Heather, that just to add on to what you've said, I think that we talked about it, and I think this series of sessions in the Knowledge Summit will go a long way towards talking about how we should move forward to ensure that the feminist perspective is more regularly employed. I think I touched on it on the slide, talking about how to infuse a feminist perspective in terms of claiming space for women. I think this for me is the big part of it, is that we've somehow allowed the space to shrink to such an extent that we're almost apologetic about why we're targeting women and girls, or why we're keeping our work women-centered in many ways. And I think that in itself is a way that we can move forward, is to reclaim the space with confidence that we are not we're not discriminating against men, we are not being exclusive, we are not being biased, that, to be very clear about what we're doing and why we're doing it. So it will go a long way towards making it something that happens more regularly.
I agree, actually. And one of the things that I was thinking while you were talking is about how important it is for us to reject the premise of the question so often, because the kind of resistance that we get in that makes us defensive, actually, and we start on the back foot. And I think one of the skills we need to practice, and one of the skills we need to become much more accomplished at, is rejecting the premise of the question and not feeling defensive. It's something about claiming that space and saying, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you do this? It's one of the greatest human rights violations in existence. It's the worst kept secret, and we all know that it's going on. So why wouldn't you do this? What's wrong with you? And really landing that solidly.
Yeah, that's such an important way to reframe. Instead of saying, why should women be included, you should say, why not?
Yeah, why aren't you? And really I think one of the big pieces in this for me is us stopping doing the patriarchy's work for it and really holding them to account with a kind of, why are you excluding women? Explain that to me, justify that to me. Tell me why you think it's a rational thing to do.
Somebody's just said it's exhausting when you have to keep defending your work. Thank you for that, because that is really the experience.
It really is. And I think that goes back to this parallel process idea, that because we're on the back foot and because we're defending it, actually we are drawn into that patriarchal dynamic again of asking nicely in a very feminized way, of trying to be polite, of hoping that if we do it nicely enough, somebody will concede a little bit of ground to us. And I think there's really something important about starting from a different place and starting from a collective position, because it's really hard to do it on your own, but starting from a collective position of, why aren't you doing this? Explain and give me evidence for why you're not. Give me data for why you're not. Show me how this is going to be in women's interests, and really to turn the whole thing on its head.
Absolutely. I think we're nearing the end. I think we've got about 4 minutes left. And I just wanted to remind everybody that we would really want you to share your feedback, to provide feedback on the session, so that we can integrate some of your comments into the next sessions, the ones that will follow this, if there are any problems that we can pick up. So we'll be very happy, and also just if we do it again next time. So there is a link that you can click on to provide us with feedback. And there are some links for you to stay in touch with us, for those of you who are not already very in touch with COFEM. So some links on Twitter, LinkedIn, there's the website, and there's an email address. I don't know if there are any other burning questions. They don't seem to be on the chat. So I think it's for us to just thank everybody very, very much for joining the Knowledge Summit, and I hope to see you on the next session. Heather?
Yes, I hope so. I hope that this introduction really has opened up some thinking and opened up some questions and given you all a taste of what's coming. I would really, really encourage people to look at the pocketbook and look at the resources in there, and hopefully we'll see you in the other sessions that are coming later. And good activisting for our 16 days. Good activisting to all of you, because we are all doing this together.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.